The kayak was still drifting when Ethan Ward disappeared. On May 19, 2012, in the lakeside community of Pine Cove, Washington, population 20403, the day began with a fog that clung low over Crescent Lake, muffling sound and softening edges until everything looked slightly unreal. By 6:15 a.m., the marina security cameras captured their last clear footage of Ethan, a 34-year-old high school science teacher, rolling his bright yellow kayak down the weathered wooden ramp toward the water he knew as well as his own classroom. He wore his usual early morning uniform, a faded University of Washington hoodie, black nylon pants, and a life jacket he'd insisted on even during the calmest conditions. In one hand, he carried a stainless steel travel mug with black coffee that he brewed strong enough to peel paint. In the other, his paddle, the blades nicked from years of scraping over hidden logs and gravel bars. The marina manager, Dan Hollister, watched Ethan from the office window, lifting his own coffee in a half salute that Ethan didn't see. This had become routine. Ethan paddled at sunrise 3 or 4 times a week, cutting clean lines across the often mirror-still lake before most of Pine Cove woke up. During fall and winter, he came in headlamp and thermal gear. In spring and summer, he sometimes lingered to chat with anglers heading out or retirees shuffling down to see what the lake looked like that day. He was the kind of regular whose presence became part of the scenery, so woven into the environment that people stopped really registering him until he wasn't there anymore. At 6:19 a.m., security footage showed Ethan easing the kayak into the water, climbing in with the practiced fluidity of someone who'd done this hundreds of times and pushing off from the dock. The fog was thick but patchy, swirling in slow motion across the surface. The visibility dropped to maybe 50 yards in places, less in others, but Ethan had navigated worse. He checked his watch, took a sip from his travel mug, adjusted his life jacket strap with his left hand, and then paddled out of camera range, disappearing into the gray. Nothing in his posture suggested distress, hesitation, or fear. He looked like exactly what he was, a man starting another ordinary morning in a town that believed it understood the boundaries of its world. What happened over the next 38 minutes would challenge everything Pine Cove thought it knew about safety, routine, and the reliability of the narratives people told themselves about the place they called home. The first sign that anything was wrong came at 6:57 a.m. when a pair of retirees, Mark and Carolyn Benson, arrived at Pine Cove Marina with a cooler full of bait and a thermos of tea. They'd met at Crescent Lake 40 years earlier and had been fishing the same waters together ever since, their lives measured not just in anniversaries and birthdays, but in salmon runs and stocking schedules. As they walked down the dock, Carolyn noticed the yellow kayak floating about 30 yards offshore, broadside to the gentle ripples, slowly rotating in place like a leaf caught in a lazy eddy. At first she thought nothing of it. People sometimes anchored and took photos or adjusted gear. But as they reached their usual slip, several things hit her all at once. The kayak was riderless, the paddle rested across it at an odd angle, and a stainless steel travel mug was jammed between the footrests, sending out dark ripples of spilled coffee that stained the surface of the lake. There was no sign of a person in the water. No splashing, no struggle, no cries for help. Just the soft knock of plastic hull against the gentle slap of lake and the far-off hum of a logging truck up on Highway 7. Mark called out automatically, his voice carrying weirdly in the fog. "Hello out there. You okay?" No answer. The silence felt wrong, like a missing line in a well-rehearsed script. After a moment, Mark muttered something about idiots not tying off their boats, climbed clumsily into their aluminum fishing boat, and motored the short distance to the drifting kayak. By the time he grabbed its bow handle, his initial irritation had curdled into something else. The cockpit was empty, but Ethan's life jacket lay neatly across the seat, its buckles unlatched. The paddle was resting across the cockpit rim, blades equally balanced, as if someone had laid it there carefully. The travel mug, its lid snapped open, still radiated faint heat when he touched it. Mark's stomach dropped. People took off their life jackets on the water all the time, but Ethan wasn't a people. Everyone at the marina knew he was almost militant about water safety, the kind of guy who lectured teenagers about wearing flotation devices in waist-deep water and kept spare whistles in his car just in case. Mark's fingers trembled as he looped the Kayak's tow line around his wrist and started the motor again, towing the empty boat slowly back to the dock where Carolyn watched with a growing sense of dread. She might not recognize every kayak at the marina, but she recognized this one. Yellow with a strip of black duct tape along one side where a deep scratch had been repaired. She'd watched Ethan launch in it dozens of times over the last few years, exchanging nods and occasional small talk about the weather or the fishing. As Mark cut the engine and the two boats bumped gently against the dock, Carolyn reached down and flipped over the travel mug to read the name printed in block letters along the side in permanent marker. Ward. She didn't need the name to know who it belonged to, but the confirmation made her feel like the dock had shifted under her feet. She looked up toward the marina office where Dan was leaning against the doorframe, coffee in hand, squinting through the fog to see what the Bensons were doing. Her voice came out sharper than she intended. Dan, this is Ethan S. Where is he? The next few minutes unfolded in a flurry of overlapping movements and half-finished sentences. Dan jogged down the ramp, his heavy work boots thudding against the boards. He peered into the kayak, checked the water around the dock, and then glanced out into the fog that still clung stubbornly to the center of the lake. A faint breeze had started up from the west, creating small ripples that shimmered and vanished. There was no sign of a person, no hat, no backpack, no splashing. Dan's first instinct was mundane. Maybe he fell in and swam to shore. Ethan was a competent swimmer. The lake was cold but not lethal in May. People slipped and swam to safety all the time. Maybe he'd already walked back up to his truck to grab something dry. Dan glanced at the gravel parking lot beyond the chain-link fence that marked the marina boundary. Ethan's battered blue Subaru Outback sat in its usual solitary place near the sign that read, "Customer parking only." No new footprints disturbed the damp gravel around it. No door stood open. No evidence suggested anyone had returned to the vehicle since Ethan had locked it that morning. A habit he maintained, even though half of Pine Cove still left keys in ignitions. Dan felt the first flicker of real unease then, a crawling sensation at the base of his neck that had nothing to do with the chilly air. He swallowed it down and reached for procedure. Call 911. Get the sheriff's department involved. It could be nothing. It could be a scare. But if it wasn't, he didn't want to be the one who wasted crucial minutes pretending this was normal. The Grays Harbor County Sheriff's office logged the call at 7:06 a.m. The dispatcher, a woman named Brenda who worked the radios for nearly 20 years, had handled everything from bar fights to logging accidents to the occasional domestic situation, but water calls always tightened something in her chest. Too many variables. Too much that could go wrong too fast. She dispatched a patrol unit to the marina and simultaneously contacted the volunteer fire department's rescue boat crew. The words she used were neutral, the same ones she'd used a dozen times before. Possible missing person last seen kayaking. Vessel located without occupant. Within 15 minutes, 2 sheriff's deputies, a rescue boat, and 3 members of the volunteer fire department were converging on Pine Cove Marina, their flashing lights cutting through the morning fog with the surreal clarity of emergency. By 7:21 a.m., Deputy Carla Simmons, 31, 6 years in the department, stood on the dock beside the yellow kayak, her boots slick with lake spray, her notepad already half filled with meticulous handwriting. The scene was almost too simple. The kayak, the paddle, the life jacket, the travel mug. Ethan's Subaru in the parking lot. No sign of struggle on the dock, no flipped boards, no gouge marks, no spilled gear. It was as if Ethan had simply ceased to exist somewhere between the security camera's last frame and the Bensons' arrival. The rescue boat crew, led by Fire Chief Wayne Porter, began a slow grid search of the area where the kayak had been drifting. They dragged the water with hooks in widening circles, their faces set in the grim, focused expressions of men who'd recovered bodies before and hoped they weren't about to do it again. The fog thinned gradually as the sun climbed higher, revealing the full expanse of Crescent Lake, 2.5 miles long, half a mile wide at its broadest point, ringed by dense Douglas fir and cedar forest that swallowed sound and cast long shadows even at midday. Fishermen might call it beautiful. That morning it looked indifferent. Indifference, Simmons thought as she watched the rescue boat move in careful arcs, was sometimes worse than hostility. Hostility you could at least negotiate with. By 8:03 a.m., the first negative result came in. No sign of a body, no clothing, no floating debris traced to Ethan. Divers from the neighboring county were requested, their estimated arrival time stretching out like something elastic and cruel. Simmons turned her attention to the land, the inspection of Ethan S. car, the marina office, the security cameras. The Subaru S doors were locked. Inside, on the passenger seat, she found a canvas messenger bag containing graded chemistry quizzes, a dog-eared copy of a field guide on Pacific Northwest freshwater ecosystems, and a spiral notebook filled with neat, color-coded lesson plans. The glove compartment held registration papers, an old pair of sunglasses, and a half-melted pack of breath mints. The car had the lived-in order of someone who moved through life with quiet routines, not the chaotic jumble of a person planning an escape. His phone was not in the vehicle. That detail would become significant later. In the marina office, Dan pulled up footage from the security system, an aging but functional network of 4 cameras that recorded the parking lot, the ramp, the dock entrance, and the general water line. They didn't cover every angle. No small Marina S cameras ever did, but they showed enough. Simmons watched as Ethan S. Subaru pulled in at 6:07 a.m. As he got out, locked the door, and walked with steady, unhurried steps toward the dock. She watched him exchange a half-wave with Dan through the office window, load his kayak into the water, climb in, and paddle into the fog. The grainy footage, time-stamped 6:19 a.m., was the last visual record of Ethan Ward alive. There was no sign of anyone following him down the ramp, no shadow moving behind the storage shed, no other vehicle pulling in or out until the Bensons arrived. Simmons replayed the segment 3 times before turning to Dan. "Has anyone else been down here this morning other than Ethan and the Bensons?" Dan shook his head slowly. "Not that I saw. It's his Saturday. The early birds don't usually hit the water until the sun's really up, and nobody came in by foot from the road or the trail. Brenda said the Bensons were the first 911 call we got all morning." Simmons felt the weight of the timeline settle in her mind. Ethan arrives at 6:07 a.m., launches at 6:19 a.m. The Bensons arrive at 6:57 a.m. They see the drifting kayak almost immediately. That leaves a window of, at most, 30 minutes where something could have happened. 30 minutes in a calm lake, to an experienced kayaker in a life jacket that was now inexplicably resting, unused, in the cockpit of his boat. It wasn't just what was there that bothered her. It was what wasn't he, no scratch marks along the hull, no damage to indicate a collision with another boat, no sign that the kayak had been capsized and righted again. The seat was dry, the interior mostly free of water, aside from a thin sheen of condensation consistent with an early morning launch. It was as if Ethan had stepped out of the kayak mid-lake and walked away on the surface. Later that morning, around 9:12 a.m., Crescent Lake High School S Vice Principal Melissa Hart answered a call from the Sheriff S Department that made her sit down hard at her desk. She'd assumed, like everyone else, that the day's biggest challenge would be breaking up yet another argument between seniors about prank week. Instead, she found herself listening to a deputy ask questions about Ethan's personality, habits, potential stressors. Did he seem depressed? Had he talked about leaving town? Was there anything in his behavior over the last few weeks that might suggest suicidal ideation? The questions fell into a familiar pattern she recognized from mandatory training sessions about crisis response. But applying those templates to Ethan felt like forcing the wrong puzzle piece into a picture that wasn't indeed supposed to exist. Ethan had joined Crescent Lake High 3 years earlier, trading a research track in Seattle for a teaching position in a town most people couldn't have found on a state map without help. He'd thrown himself into the work with the kind of energy that annoyed burnt-out colleagues and inspired students who'd never before considered that science could be anything other than dry facts and multiple-choice exams. He built an after-school robotics club from scratch, started a citizen science water sampling project with the lake, and turned the annual science fair into the kind of event parents actually attended voluntarily. If he was secretly unhappy, he hid it behind a meticulously consistent routine. Morning paddles, daytime teaching, evening grading, occasional trivia nights at the only bar in town that pretended to care about craft beer. His closest colleague, a history teacher named Adrian Miller, could think of only one recent change in Ethan's behavior. About 3 weeks earlier, Ethan had started staying late in his classroom, long after the custodial staff finished their rounds. When Adrian had teased him about having a secret romance, Ethan had just smiled tightly and said he was working on something for the lake project. He hadn't elaborated, and Adrian, busy with his own life, hadn't pressed. It would be days before anyone realized that Ethan's cryptic something and the morning he disappeared were more connected than they could have imagined. By noon on May 19th, Crescent Lake's rumor machine had already shifted into overdrive. At Rosalie's Diner, the only place in town where you could get both a decent omelet and a detailed breakdown of everyone's business. The lunch crowd formed spontaneous theory clusters at the worn Formica tables. Some insisted Ethan must have flipped his kayak and drowned, pointing out that lakes could be deceptive and cold water shock was a real danger. Others argued that an experienced paddler like Ethan would never have taken off his life jacket on the water. A more cynical contingent whispered about secret debts and double lives, spinning scenarios in which the empty kayak was a stage prop for a carefully planned disappearance. The fact that his phone was missing while his wallet remained in his car only added fuel to those narratives. If he was dead, where was the body? If he was alive, where had he gone in a town with only 2 main roads in and out and a community that prided itself on noticing outsiders? Deputy Simmons, standing on the marina dock as the divers arrived and the search area expanded, didn't have answers yet. All she had was a growing list of questions and an unease that settled deeper with every negative result. The lake wasn't giving them a body. The shoreline search wasn't producing a soaked, disoriented man who decrawled to safety. The security footage wasn't showing a second person, a suspicious vehicle, or anything that would anchor the morning's events to a familiar pattern of crime or accident. Somewhere between 6:19 and 6:57 a.m., Ethan Ward had vanished from a stable kayak on a calm lake in full view of a shoreline where a town of 2,203 people slept, brewed coffee, packed lunches, and assumed that morning would follow the same rules as the day before. It would take years, multiple investigators, and technological advances that didn't yet exist to untangle what really happened on the water that morning, and why the silence at Pine Cove Marina echoed so loudly through the next decade of Ethan Ward's cold case. Ethan Ward's disappearance settled over Pine Cove like a marine layer that refused to burn off, thickening by the hour as search efforts expanded across Crescent Lake and into the surrounding forest. By 2:14 p.m. on May 19, 2012, the sheriff's command post had taken shape in the marina parking lot, transforming the normally quiet gravel stretch into a hive of controlled urgency. Orange rescue kayaks lay stacked beside the volunteer fire department's aluminum boat. Divers in black neoprene suits moved with deliberate slowness as they adjusted air tanks and regulators, and deputies crisscrossed the lot carrying maps, clipboards, and radios that crackled with intermittent updates. Deputy Simmons stood at the center of the activity like a fixed point in a storm, her notebook now filled with observations that did nothing to resolve the central contradiction of the morning. How an experienced paddler could vanish from a stable kayak in calm water without leaving behind a single piece of clothing, gear, or biological trace. The divers completed their first sweep of the primary search zone at 2:47 p.m., resurfacing one by one with the same answer: nothing. The lakebed in that area was sand and silt with the occasional submerged log. Visibility was decent for a cold water lake. If Ethan had sunk there, they would have found him. The absence of a body forced Simmons to widen the radius, and by late afternoon, 3 dive teams were working simultaneously in designated sectors that extended toward the deeper center trench of Crescent Lake, where depths reached nearly 200 feet. Every expansion increased the logistical strain. Divers could only stay submerged for limited intervals, and air tanks required refilling at the fire station 2 miles away. Volunteers combing the shoreline found nothing but driftwood, goose feathers, and bottle caps left behind by teenagers the previous weekend. The lack of evidence did not feel like the aftermath of an accident. It felt curated, as though someone had made sure nothing unnecessary remained. At 4:33 p.m., the first personal connection to the investigation walked into the command post. Ethan S.'s younger sister, Rachel, who had driven from Olympia the moment she heard from a co-worker that something was happening at Crescent Lake. She entered the lot with the brisk determination of someone who'd learned to carry family crises alone since their mother's death 5 years earlier. Her dark hair hung loose around her face, her eyes flushed from crying during the 90-minute drive, but her voice was steady as she identified Ethan S. Subaru and confirmed that the messenger bag, the coffee mug, the kayak, and the life jacket were all his. When Simmons carefully explained the situation, Rachel pressed her palms hard against her forehead, as though physically resisting the information. "Ethan, doesn't he take off his life jacket on the water?" she said, cutting through the murmurs of radio chatter around them. "He doesn't even unbuckle it at the dock until the kayak is out. You are telling me that was sitting in the seat like he folded it? That doesn't make sense." Simmons agreed silently. Nothing made sense. Rachel asked to see the security footage. Simmons hesitated, then led her to the marina office, where Dan replayed the relevant segment. Rachel watched her brother walk down the ramp, paddle with even strokes, and disappear into the fog, her face tightening into a frown born of recognition. "He looks normal," she said, "but he wasn't a normal this week. He was frustrated, preoccupied. He told me on Wednesday he thought someone was messing with his lake samples. He didn't elaborate, and when I asked again on Friday, he said, 'Never mind. I figured it was just school stress.'" Simmons paused. "Lake samples? For what?" Rachel shrugged. "His water project. He started it for his students, but then I don't know, he got interested in something specific. I thought it was environmental stuff. He wasn't the type to explain when he thought he could figure it out himself." Simmons wrote down the note, though she wasn't yet sure how it mattered. Missing persons cases often sprouted tangents that led nowhere, but Rachel S. phrasing stuck with her. Someone was messing with his sample. Interference suggested human involvement. Human involvement suggested motive. At 6:12 p.m., with the sky deepening into shades of lavender behind the tree line, the Sheriff's Department officially suspended the active lake search for the night due to visibility concerns. Divers surfaced reluctantly, stripping off their gear under the watchful eyes of townspeople who had gathered behind yellow tape to see whether hope or grief would be announced. The crowd had grown as news spread. Cars lined both sides of Lakeshore Road, and a low murmur of conversation blended with the distant hum of boat engines. Among the faces Simmons recognized were several of Ethan S. students, 3 of whom clung together in oversized hoodies as they waited for information. Word had also reached Ethan's closest colleague, the history teacher Adrian Miller, who arrived shortly before the search suspension in a windbreaker and baseball cap, looking like someone who'd run from his house without finishing a thought. He asked to speak privately with Simmons. In the shadow of the storage shed, he folded his arms tightly as though bracing himself. "Ethan didn't tell people when he was worried," Adrian said, "but he told me one thing last week that I can't shake. On Tuesday, he said there was something strange in the water readings. Not contaminants, patterns, like something artificial. He said he was going to compare them to old data from the logging company, maybe even confront someone if he confirmed it." He laughed, but it wasn't funny. Simmons scribbled rapidly. "What logging company?" "Pine Ridge Timber. They used to dump runoff into the watershed 20 or 30 years ago." There was a lawsuit in the 90s that got sealed. Ethan read about it for the environmental science unit. I didn't think he would get involved. He wasn't a confrontational, but he was stubborn. Stubborn people walked into trouble more easily than reckless ones, Simmons thought. They stepped directly into the heart of a problem because they believed truth outweighed danger. By 7:28 p.m., the last rescue boat had been docked. The crowd had dispersed, and the marina felt eerily normal again, the way disaster scenes sometimes do after emergency lights stop flashing. Simmons remained on site with a small team to conduct a land sweep of the forested trailhead near the shoreline. Crescent Lake's western trail loop was a 1.8-mile path that wound through dense growth before curving back toward the marina. It was used mostly by joggers and birdwatchers. If Ethan had swum or climbed out of the lake for any reason, this trail would have been the most logical exit point. The deputies spread out with flashlights, calling Ethan's name while scanning the damp earth for prints. The spring rain and morning fog had softened the soil, making it a natural trap for impressions. They found several: runners, hikers, a dog walker, but no bare feet or wet shoe prints consistent with someone climbing out of the lake. The search continued along the northern bank until darkness made further progress pointless. Back at the command post, Simmons reviewed the day's findings with Sheriff Walton, a broad-shouldered man who'd spent 30 years in rural law enforcement, and understood that most missing persons reports resolved within the first 24 hours. Walton listened as Simmons summarized the timeline, the lack of physical evidence, and the statements from Rachel and Adrian. At the mention of the sealed 1990s lawsuit, Walton's expression hardened. The Pine Ridge matter had been a sore spot in the county for decades. The company closed its local operations in 1998 and relocated out of state, but rumors about buried chemical drums and tampered water tests had persisted through multiple administrations. Walton didn't say much, but Simmons registered a subtle tension in his posture that suggested he disliked where the information was pointing. They ended the briefing on a subdued note. The official plan for the next morning was to resume water searches with fresh divers, expand the shoreline grid, canvass lakefront homeowners, and obtain warrants for Ethan's phone records as well as for the school projects he'd been working on. At 10:04 p.m., Simmons finally left the marina, her thermos empty and her mind crowded with questions that jostled for space. When she reached her patrol SUV, she paused, glancing once more at the now dark dock where Ethan's kayak had been found mere hours earlier. A faint wind stirred the surface of the lake. Moonlight cast a silver gleam across the water. Everything looked peaceful, deceptively so. Crescent Lake didn't look like a place that swallowed people. But that was the problem with lakes. They looked innocent until the moment they weren't. At 10:32 p.m., as Simmons drove along Lakeshore Road toward town, her radio clicked to life. It was the night dispatcher with an unexpected update. A hiker on the South Shoreline Trail had reported seeing a light brief flickering near the water's edge just 10 minutes earlier. No fires allowed on the trails, the dispatcher added. The hiker said it looked small, like a phone screen. Simmons swung the SUV around at the first turnout, gravel skidding beneath her tires. A light on the shoreline this late could mean nothing. Or it could mean Ethan. Or it could mean someone else entirely. Half the mystery of missing person cases wasn't the disappearance itself. It was who else might be out there in the dark, moving through the same spaces the missing person had moved through, leaving traces too subtle to catch in daylight. The hiker waited at the trailhead, nervous and breathless, insisting he de-glimpsed the light near the old logging dock, an abandoned structure from the Pine Ridge timber days, barely standing after years of storms and neglect. No one used it anymore. No one had for at least a decade. Simmons' pulse quickened as she followed the hiker's pointing gesture toward the darkness beyond the trees. 90 minutes earlier, she'd been ready to go home. Now the night had shifted again, heavy with the sense that something new had surfaced just beneath the calm facade of the lake. Something that might explain how Ethan Ward vanished in less than half an hour and why he'd been on the water that morning in the first place. The South Shoreline Trail swallowed Simmons almost immediately. the darkness under the dense cedar canopy turning her flashlight beam into a narrow white ribbon that cut through the underbrush. The hiker remained behind at the trailhead as instructed, arms crossed tightly as though afraid the trees themselves might shift after she left. It was 10:41 p.m., and the night had thickened in that way. Pacific Northwest forests often did quiet, damp, and so layered in shadow that depth perception became unreliable. Simmons followed the winding path until she reached the fork that split toward the old logging dock, a place teenagers sometimes dared each other to visit but which most adults avoided out of habit rather than superstition. The trail sloped gently toward the lake, the scent of wet soil rising with each step. As she approached the clearing, the faint creak of wood against water drifted through the trees, a slow, rhythmic groan born from decades of decay. The dock itself lay half-collapsed, its western side sagging into the water, support beams leaning at angles that suggested one more winter storm might finish the job nature had started. Simmons swept her flashlight across the clearing. No movement, no figure, no fresh prints. She scanned again, slower this time, letting the beam trace the warped planks, the rusted bolts, the moss creeping up the beams like a slow, patient infestation. Nothing. Until something glinted along the waterline, a faint silvery speck that caught her light at the right angle. She crouched, stepping closer. Nestled between two rotting planks half submerged in lake water, lay a thin rectangular object. She fished it out with a gloved hand, wiped the surface against her jacket, and felt her pulse spike. A phone, a black phone with a slim protective case. The back bore a worn decal of a double helix, the exact style she'd seen on the cover of the binder in Ethan's classroom 2 months earlier when she'd visited during a school safety inspection. The screen was cracked diagonally, small shards missing near the upper edge. Water pooled in its charging port, and algae clung to the casing as if it had been submerged for hours rather than minutes. But it was, unmistakably, Ethan's phone. She tried the power. Button. No response. The water damage was too extensive, but even dead phones could be data gold mines with the right forensic tools. The discovery shifted the investigation in an instant. Phones didn't drift to obscure docks by accident. Someone had to bring it here, drop it here, or throw it here. And if Ethan had accidentally fallen from his kayak, this dock was nearly a mile from where his vessel had been found. He would have had to swim across cold water against wind without leaving behind a single track on the shore or trail. It did not fit. The flashlight beam swept the shoreline again, slowly, deliberately, lingering on the mud near the base of the dock, moist, dark, and ridged with the impressions of raccoon tracks. No human prints stood out clearly, though a few irregular depressions suggested either partial erosion or someone stepping lightly in shoes with shallow treads. The mud made interpretation difficult. It absorbed and blurred edges easily. Still, Simmons noted 3 faint ridges that looked more deliberate than natural. She knelt and pressed lightly beside them, fresh enough that water seeped in to fill the impressions. Someone had been here recently. Her radio crackled. "Simmons, this is dispatch. Any update on the light?" She answered quickly. "Found a phone, likely the missing subject S. Requesting evidence kit and backup to secure area." The reply was immediate. "Copy. Units en route. Estimated arrival 9 minutes." That window felt both too long and too short. Simmons remained crouched near the waterline, listening for anything that didn't belong in a forest at night. The usual nocturnal sounds, crickets, distant owl calls, something rustling high in a cedar threaded into the air. But underneath them was another sound, a faint one. Footsteps, behind her. She spun, flashlight sweeping across the path she'd descended. Nothing. Just darkness and the pale suggestion of moonlight caught in the mist drifting between branches. She waited, breath steady. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3. A twig snapped, sharp and unmistakable, 20 feet to her left. She pivoted, reaching for her holster with one hand, raising the flashlight with the other. Who was there? Silence followed, thick and almost suffocating. Then the bushes shifted slightly and the beam of her light caught a flash of something fabric, possibly, or the edge of a backpack. But it slipped out of sight almost immediately, retreating toward the deeper woods. Simmons advanced 2 steps, but before she could call out again, her radio burst to life with 2 overlapping transmissions, one announcing the arrival of rescue units, the other alerting her that Rachel Ward had shown up unexpectedly at the marina and was demanding to speak with her immediately. Simmons responded curtly and kept her focus ahead. Whoever or whatever she'd seen was gone now. She backed away from the tree line carefully, never fully turning her back, and stood guard over the dock until the backup unit arrived, a younger deputy named Flores, breathless from running part of the trail to shorten the response time. Together they sealed the scene with evidence tape and secured the phone in an evidence bag. Flores swept the area with a portable floodlight, revealing more of the irregular depressions near the shoreline, but none clear enough to cast definitive impressions. By midnight, the scene was fully processed. The phone would go to the lab first thing in the morning for a data extraction attempt. Simmons returned to the marina to find Rachel pacing near the sheriff's SUV, arms clutched around herself, face drawn tight with worry and exhaustion. "Did you find something?" Simmons nodded once. "I found Ethan's phone." Rachel's breath hitched. "Where?" Simmons hesitated. "At the old logging dock." The answer sank into Rachel slowly. She looked toward the dark outline of the tree line, her throat tightening. He never went near that place. He hated it. He said it creeped him out. Simmons filed that detail away. Another deviation from Ethan's patterns. Another suggestion of external involvement. Rachel added quietly, "He wouldn't have gone there alone, especially not at night." Simmons didn't respond. Not until all evidence had been processed and all leads examined could she form conclusions. But privately, she agreed with the sentiment. The phone at the dock was a message. Whether intentional or incidental, it indicated direction, path, movement. The next morning, Sunday, May 20th, search operations resumed at sunrise. Divers returned to the water. Drones were launched for aerial sweeps. Deputies canvassed lakefront cabins. A K-9 team arrived from a neighboring county, sweeping the trail near the old logging dock. The dog alerted twice near the clearing, nose to the ground, circling repeatedly near the same faint depression Simmons had noticed. But the scent trail ended abruptly near the edge of the dock, fading into the water or dispersing in the night air. At 9:16 a.m., the forensic tech assigned to Ethan's phone called Simmons with a preliminary update. The phone was too waterlogged to power on, but they managed to begin a data extraction. The text message logs had partially recovered. The last outgoing message from Ethan was time-stamped 5:52 a.m. the morning he vanished. The recipient, an unsaved number. The content, "I need to show you what I found. Meet at the dock. Don't tell anyone." The hair on Simmons' arms lifted. Dock, not marina dock. The phone had been found at the old logging dock. The unsaved number was traced to a prepaid phone purchased 2 weeks earlier at a convenience store in Aberdeen. No name, no address, no useful metadata. Burner phone, purposeful anonymity. Someone had convinced Ethan to meet them at a secluded dock before sunrise. Then somehow he ended up in his kayak instead, launching as though beginning a normal morning. That contradiction gnawed at Simmons. Why plan a meeting at a remote location, then start the day at the usual marina launch point? Unless the plan changed, unless someone intercepted him, unless the sequence involved 2 different movements, one visible, one hidden. At 10:42 a.m., another detail emerged from the phone extraction. A series of notes Ethan had typed in a hidden folder using shorthand and fragments. Levels inconsistent. February compared to April spike too high. Possible tampering of Site B. Sample from inlet behind ridgeline, unusual foam last 48 hours. Need second opinion. The notes referenced areas of the lake rarely visited by casual paddlers, and mention of tampering echoed what Rachel and Adrian had reported. By noon, investigators had cordoned off 3 separate inlets, collecting water samples for chemical analysis. Old controversies from the Pine Ridge timber era resurfaced in murmurs among the deputies, illegal dumping, settlement agreements, sealed case files. A retired environmental officer interviewed by phone mentioned that one of the old discharge points fed directly into the cove less than 50 yards from the logging dock. The implication was chilling. If someone had resumed dumping or if buried containers had begun leaking, a whistleblower, especially a science teacher conducting independent testing, could be inconvenient. Motive was beginning to crystallize, but motive didn't explain the precision of the disappearance. At 2:58 p.m., the first significant lead since the phone surfaced broke through the haze of theory. A kayaker who launched from the opposite side of the lake reported seeing something unusual around 6:40 a.m. the previous morning. A small motorboat, unregistered dark green or blue hull, drifting slowly near the center trench of the lake before accelerating toward the south shoreline. The kayaker hadn't thought it suspicious until hearing the news. He'd assumed it belonged to an early morning fisherman, but the timing and direction aligned disturbingly well with the disappearance window. Simmons interviewed him personally. As he described the boat, her mind mapped its path relative to Ethan S.'s last known trajectory. Parallel movement, converging direction, predatory efficiency. She returned to the marina afterward, her thoughts circling the same unanswerable question: who had been on that boat? That evening at 7:14 p.m., a lab technician called with preliminary water sample results. The chemical profile from Inlet B behind ridgeline near the logging dock showed elevated traces of solvents not present in the baseline readings taken by the county a year earlier. The levels were small but rising, enough to indicate recent disturbance, enough to support Ethan S. notes, enough possibly to motivate someone to intervene before he went public. Simmons stood at the end of the dock as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the water turning molten orange beneath her boots. For the first time since the investigation began, a pattern not yet a full story, but the shape of one began to emerge. Ethan discovered something. Someone knew he discovered it. Someone contacted him through a burner phone. Someone arranged a meeting at an isolated location. And someone ensured he never told anyone what he found. But the lake hadn't given them his body, and the phone hadn't been lost in the water accidentally, which meant someone might still be out there watching the investigation unfold, waiting to see if the lake would continue to keep its secrets, or if someone would connect the trail of silences, shadows, and quiet manufactured absences pointing directly toward the truth beneath Crescent Lake's calm surface. The third day of the investigation began with a thin veil of fog over Crescent Lake, not nearly as dense as the morning Ethan disappeared, but enough to distort the reflected tree line and blur distance. Deputy Simmons stood on the marina dock at 6:03 a.m., coffee cooling in her hand as she watched the rescue boat team prepare for another round of deep-water grid sweeps. The stillness felt deceptive, like a held breath waiting to be exhaled. The lack of a body continued to gnaw at every searcher on the water. Even in cold lakes, even in deep water, even with trenches and irregular currents, bodies resurfaced eventually. Nothing in Crescent Lake's hydrology suggested an exception. The absence felt intentional, calculated. As the divers entered the water one by one, Simmons reviewed the previous night's notes again, focusing on the burner phone message and Ethan S. hidden data entries. The motive was solidifying into something that resembled a suppressed environmental violation, possibly revived or exposed by accident. But knowing why didn't answer how. At 7:12 a.m., she visited the high school to examine Ethan S.'s classroom more thoroughly. The morning halls were quiet, with only a few teachers arriving early. The custodian unlocked the science room, flicking on the overhead fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly. Ethan S.'s room looked as though he might return any moment, posters of ecosystems, minerals, and scientific method frameworks lining the walls. Lab tables arranged neatly. A faint scent of ethanol from the equipment cabinets. Simmons moved slowly through the room, studying the objects with the eye of someone who understood that small details could unearth buried truths. On his desk sat a stack of recycled paper charts showing water temperature changes over several months, all meticulously annotated. His handwriting appeared in multiple ink colors, blue, red, black, each corresponding to different data sources. She sifted through them carefully until she reached a set of charts labeled Site B, Site C, Site L3. The spikes in the graphs were subtle but present. Temperature fluctuations that didn't correlate with seasonal changes or surface disturbance. Nearby, a laptop sat closed beneath a pile of graded assignments. The school IT coordinator arrived minutes later to unlock it for investigation. Once accessed, the desktop revealed a single folder titled Crescent Project with subfolders named Photos, Datasets, Logging Records, and Anomalies. The last folder contained several images that Simmons clicked through slowly. One showed a faint trail of iridescent foam along the shallows behind ridgeline. Another captured a series of disturbed sediment patterns around the base of an old drainage outlet pipe, one of Pine Ridge Timber's sealed discharge points. Another image stopped her entirely. A small, rusted metal drum, partially unearthed along the inlet, tilted at an angle suggesting recent movement. A boot print appeared near it, not distinct enough for tread identification but unmistakable in shape. Someone had been there recently. Someone had found the same object Ethan photographed, and someone had likely returned to deal with the threat Ethan posed. At 8:09 a.m., the lab called with further extraction results from the phone. Only one incoming message from the burner number existed. Timestamp, 5:46 a.m. Content, meet earlier. Avoid the marina. South Dock. That message came 6 minutes before Ethan sent his own reply. The shift in timing indicated urgency, or fear, or pressure. Simmons considered the timeline carefully. 5:46 a.m. incoming message. 5:52 a.m. Ethan replies. 6:07 a.m. he arrives at marina anyway. That contradiction remained one of the story's sharpest edges. Why agree to avoid the marina, then launch from it? Unless he intended to paddle to the South Dock, or unless he wanted others to see him follow his normal route before diverting. A misdirection to protect himself, or a misdirection forced by someone else. At 9:28 a.m., while Simmons returned to the shoreline near Ridgeline to supervise water sampling, a deputy approached with new information. A fish and wildlife officer had reported a suspicious item found earlier that morning near the northwest bank. A torn piece of black plastic with chemical residue matching the solvent traces from Inlet B. The plastic was large enough to have lined a container, possibly one of the old barrels. Simmons ordered a full sweep of the area. Within 30 minutes, a deputy found a second piece of plastic lodged under a fallen log, and near it a twisted metal handle. The remains of something that had been forcibly opened, or emptied. Simmons' radio chimed again. A boater had discovered fresh scrapes on one of the public dock pylon scratches from the keel of a small motorboat. The estimated time of the markings based on algae disruption was roughly 36 to 48 hours earlier. The window aligned precisely with Ethan's disappearance. She drove to the pylon and knelt beside it, tracing the fresh marks with gloved fingers. The scratches were angled downward, consistent with a boat pulling in quickly, possibly in a rush or under duress. The marina's records listed no registered boats matching the kayaker's description from the previous day. The unregistered motorboat was becoming central. At 11:05 a.m., and while Simmons was documenting the pylon damage, Rachel Ward arrived again, this time with a man in his 30s with close-cropped hair and a rigid posture. His name was David Barrett, a co-worker of Rachel's, who had come to support her, but Simmons noted the wary tension in his expression. Rachel pulled Simmons aside and said she had remembered something else, something she had dismissed as irrelevant at the time. 3 nights before Ethan disappeared, he had called her unexpectedly. He mentioned someone approaching him after school asking questions about his water sampling project. He said the man claimed to be from an environmental nonprofit, but his questions were unusual, focused not on conservation but on specific locations Ethan sampled. He wouldn't say who the man was. He didn't describe him clearly. He just said the encounter left him uneasy. As Simmons wrote down the details, she noticed David shifting slightly, as though listening but pretending not to. When she asked Rachel whether Ethan had described the man's voice or accent, Rachel shook her head. Just that something about him felt wrong. He said he didn't trust him. He said the man seemed too interested. That detail sharpened a possibility. If Ethan had been approached at school, the individual might have followed him to the marina or intercepted him earlier. At noon, Simmons received another breakthrough. A second kayaker from Saturday came forward after hearing news coverage. He reported seeing a figure standing near the south shoreline just after 6:30 a.m. The description was vague. A man medium height wearing a hooded jacket. The kayaker assumed it was a fisherman waiting for the fog to lift. But the timing placed the figure near the old logging dock minutes before the Bensons discovered the empty kayak. Simmons added it to her timeline. She now had a burner phone arranging a covert meeting, environmental data suggesting renewed contamination, an unregistered motorboat seen in the right place at the right time, a figure at the south shoreline, and a phone deliberately placed, dropped, or discarded at the old dock. But still no sign of Ethan's body, still no proof of his fate, still no confirmation whether he had arrived at the dock or whether someone intercepted him before he reached it. At 2:23 p.m., the drone team radioed in with an alert. They had spotted a shape beneath the water near the lake's eastern trench. Large, unmoving, suspicious. Divers were dispatched immediately. Simmons drove to the site, her chest tight with dread and anticipation. As she stood on the shoreline watching divers descend into the trench, the minutes stretched painfully. She expected the radio call announcing a body. She braced for it. She rehearsed in her mind the words she would have to say to Rachel. But when the divers resurfaced, they brought no body. Instead, they hauled up a long, waterlogged tarp wrapped around what appeared to be rusted metal and degraded plastic lining the remnants of industrial waste containers. And wedged inside the folds was something else. A shoe. A Menace trail running shoe. Size 11. The sole worn in a pattern consistent with someone who walked frequently on uneven terrain. A style that matched the shoes Ethan wore in the security footage, but the shoe was old, weathered, decayed. It had been in the lake far longer than 48 hours, maybe years, maybe decades. And Ethan, according to the Bensons' account, had launched wearing water shoes, not trail shoes. The tarp was a breadcrumb from another era, another buried crime, possibly tied to Pine Ridge Timber's sealed litigation. The lake was giving up secrets, just not the one they needed. At 4:14 p.m., while the tarp was being secured for transport, a call came from the sheriff's office. A lakefront cabin owner had reviewed their private security footage after hearing about the missing teacher. At 6:31 a.m. on the morning Ethan vanished, their camera captured a faint silhouette of a small motorboat moving quickly along the tree line, headed south. A second figure was visible in the boat, a silhouette sitting low, possibly restrained. The image was grainy, the distance significant, no identification possible. But the shape of the second figure suggested someone slumped or immobilized. Simmons stared at the still frame printed onto thermal paper. The shape was ambiguous, but the timing aligned too perfectly to ignore. Someone was on the water at the precise moment Ethan vanished. Someone was moving toward the south shoreline. Someone may have been transporting a person who could not move on their own. Rachel arrived at the shoreline moments later, having been called in to view the new evidence. When she saw the image, her breath caught audibly. "That's him." Simmons asked how she could be sure. Rachel didn't answer immediately. Then, voice trembling, she said Ethan always sat slightly forward in boats. A habit from years of kayaking. His posture gave him away. Simmons couldn't verify posture from a silhouette, but the emotional recognition mattered. Behind them, the lake rippled under a sudden breeze, the light shifting across the surface like something restless beneath. The investigation was evolving rapidly, but the core truth remained maddeningly unresolved. Ethan Ward had vanished in under 30 minutes in calm water, near a community that prided itself on noticing everything. But someone had noticed more than they should have. Someone had been watching Ethan long before he disappeared. Someone had used the lake's silence as cover, and the deeper Simmons dug, the more she felt that the lake's secrets were not relics of the past, they were still alive, still shifting, still capable of swallowing the evidence of wrongdoing before anyone could reach it. And out there, someone knew exactly what happened at 6:40 a.m. on Crescent Lake, someone who had not yet made a mistake, someone who might be waiting to see how much the investigators had uncovered before deciding what to do next. The fifth day of the investigation began before sunrise, with mist curling off Crescent Lake in thin, trembling ribbons that made the water look as though it were breathing. Deputy Simmons arrived at the marina at 5:38 a.m., her sleep cut short again by the kind of dreams that weren't quite nightmares but were close enough dreams, where she stood on the lake's surface watching shadows move beneath her feet. Unable to tell which ones belonged to Ethan, she briefed the incoming divers, reviewed the shoreline grid assignments, then isolated herself in her SUV to study the blurry silhouette captured on the cabin security footage. The outline of the second figure was still maddeningly vague, but the posture, the slight lean forward, kept replaying in her mind. It wasn't the evidence, but it was a whisper. And in cold cases, whispers often mattered more than shouts. At 7:12 a.m., she drove to the county courthouse to review sealed records from the 1990s Pine Ridge timber litigation. The request, submitted urgently through the sheriff's office, had been approved under the justification that environmental hazards might still be active. The archivist, a thin, balding man with tremors in his hands, unlocked a metal cabinet containing faded folders labeled Conservation Settlement 1994 and Environmental Discharge Case 1996. Simmons sat alone in the dimly lit records room and flipped through the brittle pages, the smell of dust and old ink rising like memory. Most of the documents were heavily redacted, entire pages blacked out, names removed, site numbers replaced with codes. But the unredacted portions told enough of a story. In 1994, Pine Ridge Timber had been investigated for illegal disposal of industrial solvents along the watershed feeding Crescent Lake. Inspectors found 3 buried containers leaking residue near ridgeline, the exact area Ethan had been sampling. The company agreed to pay fines and sealed the sites under supervision. But one detail stood out. The supervising contractor responsible for sealing the containers was a man named Leonard Cole, who resigned from the company 2 months after the settlement. His final report included multiple warnings about unstable ground, incomplete sealing, and risk of future disturbance. The warnings were acknowledged, but no follow-up inspections were recorded. Simmons searched the county employment logs. Leonard Cole had stayed in Washington for several years before relocating east, but his nephew still lived in Pine Cove. The nephew, whose name appeared in the census record, was Robert Rob Cole, age 41, employed as a part-time handyman and boat mechanic, a man who owned an unregistered dark green motorboat. At 8:46 a.m., Simmons drove to the listed address, a weather-beaten cabin on the lake's western edge, partially obscured by alder trees. A narrow dirt driveway led to a detached shed, large enough to store a motorboat. No vehicle sat outside. She knocked repeatedly. No answer. She walked around the property, noting a stack of rusted tools, a sagging tarp that looked recently disturbed, and fresh tire tracks leading away from the shed. The padlock on the shed door was new. She peered through a crack in the wall. There was no boat inside. She returned to the sheriff's office to request a warrant. While paperwork moved through the judge, she interviewed 2 neighbors who provided oddly consistent details. Rob Cole wasn't social. He avoided town. He took his boat out unusually early on certain mornings. He grew agitated when asked about fishing spots. And 3 days before Ethan disappeared, he'd been seen loading heavy bags into the boat at dusk. The neighbors assumed they were tools or animal feed. Now no one was so sure. At 10:33 a.m., the judge approved the warrant. Simmons returned to the cabin with 2 deputies. They searched the shed first, finding only a few tools, a bucket of oil-stained rags, and a workbench scattered with old parts. But beneath the bench, hidden behind a loose panel, they found something that froze all 3 investigators in place. A waterproof duffel bag containing gloves, rope, and a burner phone identical to the one that had contacted Ethan. The phone inside was smashed beyond repair, but the serial batch number matched the same production lot as the device traced to the Aberdeen convenience store. Alongside it lay a stained rag with faint traces of chemical solvent. And beneath the rag, a folded paper map with a route drawn in red marker from the marina to the south shoreline. The red line ended at the old logging dock. At 11:58 a.m., as Simmons stood in the cramped shed analyzing the map, a deputy shouted from outside. A small motorboat had just been spotted moving through the East Channel green hull. No registration markings, a lone figure at the helm. Simmons sprinted to her SUV, heart slamming hard against her ribs. She radioed for marine units to intercept. The rescue boat launched immediately, engine roaring across the water. The drone team deployed overhead. The green boat accelerated as soon as the rescue craft approached, cutting sharply toward the north inlet. The drone captured its wake, slicing across the lake like a blade through glass, the boat swerving with practiced control. Whoever was driving knew these waters intimately. At 12:14 p.m., the drone recorded the moment the boat reached a narrow channel partially blocked by fallen logs. Instead of slowing, the driver executed a tight turn, skimming past the obstruction with only inches to spare. The rescue boat was forced to break pursuit to avoid collision. The drone followed the green boat until the pilot guided it beneath the thick overhang of the northern cedars, disappearing into shadows so dense the thermal camera lost the signature. Marine units searched but found nothing. The boat was gone. At 12:47 p.m., frustrated but undeterred, Simmons regrouped the team. They searched the northern shoreline footpaths, discovered patches of disturbed moss, and found a narrow indentation in the earth consistent with a dragged object or vessel. The trail led uphill toward a series of old service roads that once belonged to Pine Ridge Timber. The roads were overgrown but still accessible. They converged at an abandoned workyard, concrete slabs cracked with weeds, rusted equipment collapsing into itself, and a concrete drainage tunnel that once led runoff toward the lake. The tunnel was partially flooded now, water pooling around broken cinder blocks. Simmons stepped closer, cautious, and her flashlight beam struck something half-hidden behind debris. Fabric. Navy fabric. She waded into the shallow water and pulled it free. A torn jacket. Ethan S. jacket, the one he wore in the security footage. His name tag Ward still faintly visible on the inner lining. The fabric was soaked, stained with lake water and mud, but there were no tears suggesting violence. No obvious blood, no human tissue, just abandonment or staging. She widened the search of the workyard. Near an overturned metal drum, she found two more pieces of evidence, a small plastic sample vial identical to those used in Ethan S. water testing kits, and a second burner phone, this one intact. The phone was sealed in a plastic sleeve, the type used to protect devices from moisture. Its battery was dead, but it appeared fully functional. They bagged it and rushed it to the lab. At 3:38 p.m., the forensic team began an emergency extraction. At 4:06 p.m., Simmons received the call. They had recovered text messages from the burner phone. Most were nonsensical or coded, but one thread jumped out immediately. "He knows about Site B. He has photos. We can to let him take it public. Meet before sunrise. South Dock. Handle it quietly." And the last message, time-stamped 5:03 a.m. on the morning Ethan vanished. "Do not let him reach the marina." Simmons closed her eyes slowly as the enormity of the implication settled in. Someone planned to intercept Ethan before he launched, but he reached the marina anyway, which meant one of two things. He left earlier than his contact expected, confusing their timeline, or someone else warned him, forcing him to alter his route. At 5:14 p.m., a deputy ran toward Simmons holding another bagged item found near the drainage tunnel, a handcuff key. Old, rusted, corroded, but recent enough to have been dropped within the past day. The rescue boat captain reported that the green motorboat hadn't reappeared anywhere on the lake. It was either hidden or transported across land. At 6:22 p.m., Simmons returned to the marina to brief the team. Rachel waited there again, eyes red, voice frayed. Simmons told her they had found Ethan S. jacket, but not Ethan. Rachel broke into trembling sobs. David beside her placed a steadying hand on her back, but Simmons noticed something, a flicker in David's expression when she mentioned the burner phones, a tightening around his jaw, a small shift in weight. She filed it away for later. Her instincts were rarely wrong. After the sun set, Simmons reviewed all evidence alone in the road-lit glow of her SUV. A pattern emerged. Ethan discovered renewed contamination. Someone involved in the original cover-up still lived nearby. That person or group tried to stop him. Ethan attempted to meet them secretly. Something went wrong. A confrontation occurred between 6:20 and 6:40 a.m. A second boat was involved. Someone moved Ethan or something belonging to him toward the south shoreline. Someone staged the kayak. Someone planted the phone. Someone hid evidence near the old drainage tunnel. But the single most important question remained. Where was Ethan? The lake had not given up his body. The forest had not revealed tracks. The workyard had provided clues but no proof of death. And the burner messages hinted at something else, something chilling. Do not let him reach the marina. The words implied they expected Ethan to arrive from the forest, not from his car, which meant Ethan may have left home earlier than the cameras showed, or he may have met someone before launching, or he may have already been taken before sunrise, and the figure seen paddling away in the fog may not have been Ethan at all. The sixth day of the investigation dawned with a pale, indifferent sky, the kind of washed-out morning that made Crescent Lake look like a sheet of dull metal rather than water. Deputy Simmons arrived before the search teams, her mind replaying the same looping question she hadn't dared articulate aloud. What if the figure paddling out of the marina at 6:19 a.m. had not been Ethan Ward at all? The possibility had surfaced the previous night as she reviewed the security footage again in slow motion. The grain was too heavy to confirm facial features. The movement was practiced, efficient. Ethan's build was average enough that another man of similar height could impersonate him in bulky clothing. The hoodie obscured the head. The life jacket covered most distinguishing features. What if the launch had been staged to create the illusion that Ethan left the marina alive? If someone had already intercepted him and then used his kayak to misdirect the timeline, it would explain the contradictions. The burner messages insisting he avoid the marina, the apparent inconsistency in his route, the careful placement of his paddle and jacket, the absence of any sign of struggle on the kayak. Someone familiar with Ethan's routine could have known how he paddled, how he moved, how he loaded the kayak. They could imitate enough of his motions for camera purposes. The idea settled in Simmons' chest like a stone. She opened her laptop and cross-referenced the other surveillance angles. One detail snagged her attention. The figure never looked toward the marina office window. Ethan always waved to Dan. The figure in the footage never did. Instead, they kept their face turned downward until the fog swallowed them. At 7:22 a.m., the forensic report on Ethan's jacket arrived. Mud samples another. The fabric contained trace amounts of sediment matching the workyard drainage tunnel. The jacket had been submerged, then dragged through silt-heavy water. But there was something else. Faint chemical fingerprints consistent with industrial solvent. The same chemical signatures found at Inlet B. The contamination wasn't incidental. The jacket had been in direct contact with an area linked to the buried drums. A scientist testing samples near leaking waste containers would have had contamination on his clothing. But the pattern was inconsistent with accidental environmental contact. Instead, it suggested the jacket had been pressed against a contaminated surface deliberately or forcibly. At 8:05 a.m., a deputy radioed that Rob Cole's truck had been located on an abandoned logging road roughly 2 miles north of the lake. The vehicle was empty, the doors unlocked, tire tracks angled as though the driver had exited quickly. Simmons reached the site within 20 minutes. As she approached the truck, the forest seemed to tighten around the clearing. The air felt colder, the silence brittle. Inside the cab lay a crumpled fast food bag, a thermos still half full of coffee, and a laminated map of the western shoreline with several locations circled in red ink. The drainage tunnel, the logging dock, Inlet B, and a small cove near the far eastern trench. The pattern was methodical, calculated, purposeful. It was the route of someone scouting places to hide something or someone. Simmons scanned the surrounding ground and spotted faint impressions leading toward the tree line. Larger depressions than simple footsteps. Drag marks. Something had been pulled. Or someone. The trail extended 30 yards before disappearing into dense brush. The K9 unit arrived at 8:41 a.m. The dog caught a scent from the jacket, followed the trail through brush, over fallen logs, across uneven forest floor, deeper into the old logging routes. Then, abruptly, the dog halted near a pile of rotted boards, barking with a frantic urgency. Deputies dismantled the boards, revealing a narrow entrance to an underground crawlspace, an old storm runoff chamber sealed decades earlier when the logging camp shut down. The chamber was dark, cramped, and smelled of stagnant water and rust. Simmons dropped down with a flashlight, crouching low. The beam revealed debris, broken glass, corroded pipes, discarded gloves, torn tarp fragments. But near the far corner, something glinted. A metal clasp. She moved closer, heart hammering. A watch. A waterproof digital watch. The back engraving read, "EW Happy Birthday Mom, Ethan S. Watch." But the band was broken, the clasp bent, as though pulled off during a struggle. Nearby lay a small smear of dried blood. Not enough to suggest death, but enough to confirm violence. As she stood in the tight darkness, one thought crystallized with chilling clarity. Ethan had been in this chamber, alive, fighting, trying to escape. At 10:13 a.m., a new witness came. Forward, an elderly man named Howard Green, who lived near Ridgeline. He claimed he'd heard something unusual the morning Ethan disappeared. Not a scream, not a splash, but an engine. A small boat motor idling near the south shoreline around 6:30 a.m., then accelerating sharply. He dismissed it at the time because fishermen often arrived early, but the timing aligned perfectly with the motorboat sighting on the cabin footage. When Simmons asked if he had seen anyone on land, Green hesitated. Then he said quietly, "There was someone walking near the old logging road that morning, a man. Hood up, moving quickly, didn't look at me, didn't acknowledge me, just kept moving. I thought he was hiking, but he didn't have gear." At 11:42 a.m., the lab called with additional extractions from Ethan S. phone logs. The last location ping before it died placed the device near the south shoreline at 6:08 a.m. That was before the launch seen on camera. Simmons froze at the implication. Ethan S. phone was already near the logging dock at 6:08 a.m., 11 minutes before Ethan launched the kayak from the marina at 6:19 a.m. His phone and his body were not in the same place, and the only way that made sense was if the man launched the kayak was not Ethan Ward. At 12:22 p.m., Simmons brought together the sheriff, the lead investigator, and the search command staff. She laid out the evidence she could no longer ignore. Ethan S. phone location proving he was nowhere near the marina during the launch. The silhouette posture that could be artificially mimicked. The hood pulled low on the figure, the intercept messages, the jacket hidden near the drainage tunnel. The burner phones, the deliberate misdirection. The sheriff listened, jaw clenched. When she finished, he nodded once grimly. "Find the imposter, find the boat, find where they took Ethan." At 1:36 p.m., a breakthrough arrived unexpectedly. A deputy searching the old logging roads discovered a fresh campsite hidden beneath a thicket of alder. The fire pit was still warm. A makeshift lean-to had collapsed inward, suggesting abandonment under pressure. But the critical detail was found inside a metal ammo box hidden under soil. Documents. Old documents. Originals from the Pine Ridge timber dumping case, including unredacted site evaluations, contractor names, internal memos discussing cost-saving disposal measures, and photographs of unsealed drums. Some of the handwriting on the annotations matched sample handwriting from Leonard Cole, the original supervising contractor. But newer notes written in a different hand were more alarming. They mentioned loose ends, risk of exposure, someone digging, and the science teacher. One note read, "If he collects proof, everything is reopened. Containment must be maintained. Prevent access at all costs." Another simply said, "The lake keeps secrets." At 3:04 p.m., Rob Cole's abandoned boat was found, not in the lake, but half hidden in a dry creek bed covered with branches and camouflage tarp. Inside the hull lay scuff marks, rope fibers, and a single zip tie with a strand of blonde hair tangled in it. Ethan's hair was blonde. Simmons felt her pulse spike as she examined the interior more closely. Under the seat, tucked into a storage compartment, she found a plastic container. Inside it was Ethan's class keycard, the same one he used to access the school labs. And beneath the keycard, a folded scrap of waterproof paper. It was a torn page from Ethan's field notebook, written in hurried, shaky pen strokes. Not an accident. Someone watching the samples. If something happens to me, check the tunnels. They're moving things at night. Dante trust. The sentence ended in a jagged line, interrupted. At 4:17 p.m., a call came from dispatch. A hiker on the eastern trail had found something large, something floating. Simmons arrived 10 minutes later, breath clenching. But it wasn't a body. It was a duffel bag, heavy, waterlogged, secured with rope. Deputies cut it open. Inside were two items. A stack of sealed sample jars labeled Site B Ethan's handwriting, and Ethan's wallet. His ID, his cards. His name written in careful blue ink. The wallet was dry inside the seal, meaning someone had intentionally preserved it before dumping it. Symbolic staging. A message: Ethan didn't disappear by accident. He was taken. At 6:39 p.m., as sunset bled into the treetops, a final piece fell into place. The forensic team recovered a partial fingerprint from the inside of the burner phone found in Rob Cole's shed. The print belonged not to Rob, but to someone else. Someone who had been close to the investigation from the beginning. Someone who had an opportunity to intercept evidence, influence witnesses, and appear helpful. Someone who had been at the marina when Ethan's kayak was discovered. The fingerprint belonged to David Barrett, the friend who had accompanied Rachel, the man who hovered near the investigation. The man who insisted he barely knew Ethan, yet his fingerprint was inside the device used to lure Ethan to the dock. Simmons stared at the lab report, a cold dread settling deep into her bones. Because if David Barrett was involved, then the conspiracy was no longer a relic of a logging company from the 90s. It was alive, active, present. And Ethan Ward, if still alive, was somewhere only they could find. The truth was no longer about contamination, or buried waste, or old settlements. Ethan hadn't stumbled onto a crime. He had stepped into the path of people who had been protecting that crime for decades. And those people had planned for more than silence. They had planned for disappearance. Only one part remained unknown. Whether Ethan was still somewhere in the forest fighting to survive or already part of the lake's cold, quiet secrets.